this pandemic is really bringing a lot of challenges and a lot of situations, and in the midst of the pandemic and corona and the killing and the lockdown and the social distancing and the killing or the murder of George Floyd, and demonstration everywhere now, and nobody talks about the corona anymore, and nobody's a huge debate now about mask and medical debate. There is a economic debate. Not everybody has an access to mask, but also the most
Right.
important one is, like everything else, it's the culture and debate, the symbolism. And masks has been stigmatized for so long, and as our guest today talking about how this mask and the stigma that has with a Muslim woman, that they were wearing burqa all their life for 1500 years. Now people found out that's not a bad idea. Even President Trump,
Right.
Trump himself, he said, "I don't mind people wearing masks." And so, I know Muslim women with their burqa and headscarf are getting off the hook, and maybe they're not stranger in the street anymore, and people are not looking at giving them that look or calling 911. Professor Heather Akou, assistant professor of fashion history. In general, fashion and clothes has different function and different symbolism through history. Take us through about the significance of mask aimed pandemic.
Right. Well, okay. So I wrote an article or published an article 2 years ago about face coverings, and in particular, because I've done a fair amount of research about contemporary Islamic fashion, Islamic dress, I was thinking about the burqa ban laws, which turned into the burkini bans, and in particular about the Chinese fashion. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's something called a face kini, which is basically like a ski mask that you wear for swimming. So people who wear these face kinis don't necessarily cover their arms or legs or anything. It's not really about modesty. It's about keeping your face from getting tanned. So I was writing about, how funny that was, that, face kinis seem totally fine. And yet, why are people losing it so much about wearing, Muslim women wearing niqab? And so I wrote this article for a journal called Fashion Theory about this history. And so before I get into what I was explaining with that, I want to say, as far as the pandemic goes, that certainly, there's an element to it of masks are a medical device. And certainly there are some people, I'm sure, who are rejecting masks because they say, oh, the doctors need it more, or I don't believe in science. That's my, so I'm not going to do what some scientist tells me to do. Or because, people like Trump said, I'm not going to wear a mask. And this article that I wrote, so I was looking at specifically about the burqa bans, and I started looking into the history of laws against covering your face. And what I found was that the first laws in contemporary history, so we're talking about the last 200 years or so, the first laws, at least in English, written against covering your face were to try to stop KKK members. And they were written here in the US. So these laws were actually not very successful. There were many states that enacted different laws, and basically the general idea of them was that they made it illegal to be out in public, especially on quote unquote the highway, so like public streets, you couldn't be out in public streets with your face covered. The thing is that these were always really difficult to enforce because they typically were also written to say that this had something to do with committing crime. So if you were just, out in public, even if it was very clear that you were a member of the KKK, if you weren't actually committing a crime, then what were they supposed to prosecute you for? So these laws existed, but they were very rarely applied or successful because of the difficulty of proving intent, right? Okay, so that was one. The second time that these laws started appearing was in Europe, in Italy, during the 1970s, because at that time you had people who were taking political action while wearing balaclavas. And so, you know, whatever your political sympathies were, if you thought that was a good thing that they were doing or a bad thing that they were doing, the point was that, you know, different cities in Italy decided that they wanted to stop people from covering their faces to conceal their identity while committing a crime. So that was a new set of laws that were put into effect. So then, you know, 2004, France passes the law about restrictions on religious symbols, which apply specifically to public K-12 students, didn't apply to adults. And a lot of people decided that that just wasn't really enough for them. They needed another law. And so they started agitating for the Burqa ban laws. And so, you know, of course, I think people, even the most ardent supporters of that law, realize that you can't just say, well, this is a law that applies only to Muslims. Like, of course, that was going to be overturned in the courts. So they wrote this law. It's not a very lengthy law. It still makes a bunch of assumptions. It particularly assumes that immigrants are the only ones who'd be stupid enough to cover their faces in public or to be coerced into covering their faces. It definitely assumes that there's an element of coercion involved, because there's a penalty not just for the person who wears the face covering, but for the person who coerces you into wearing the face covering. But so this law went into effect, but there was a delay of about 6 months. So the French government wrote this law. They didn't immediately implement it. They said there would be a 6-month waiting period. Now, it just so happens that when that law comes out, so the system in France is that when a new national law is coming out, the head of the national police issues a circular that explains to police officers around the country how the law is going to be enforced, like interpreting what does this really mean and how is this going to affect our policing practices. So he wrote this circular, but there was another law that was also just coming into effect called LOPSI 2, which is a series of regulations on security. Now that law, which was really about like cyber crimes and political protesters and committing crimes on public transportation, things like that, just happened to also include a provision about covering your face. And so that part of LOPSI 2 says that if you are on public transportation, so a train, for example, and you commit a crime while wearing a face covering, which everyone knows, you know, you're concealing your identity, that there's an enhanced penalty. So if the penalty is 40,000 euros for committing the crime, it's going to be 100,000 euros if you had your face covered. So the police, you know, the head of police is writing these circulars, and these two things literally came out within days of one another. And so he confused them. And part of the advice about what officers should do about women wearing niqab overlapped with the advice about the security laws. So a couple of years later, of course, after the law was enacted, there was a woman in France who took a case to the European Court of Human Rights. She said, you know, I don't wear niqab all the time, but I want to have the right to. And in her argument, she described how, you know, she's willing to take it off for security purposes. And so even though security was not part of the quote unquote Burqa ban law, because it came out at the same time as LOPSI 2, and because of all the technological changes with facial recognition software, it became part of the European Court of Human Rights reaction to this law. Now, they actually let the law stand, which I think they're still going to be dealing with the fallout from that. But since that law was enacted in France, there have been lots of other countries in Europe that have enacted their own kinds of face covering laws. And sometimes they're really specific. So like Germany, for example, enacted a law that you can't wear a face covering in your own car. And it's because they use facial recognition software to catch people who are committing traffic violations. So they need to be able to identify you. You can cover your face on the street in Germany, but you can't cover your face in your own car.
Look at differently, and sometimes you know, I know white privilege there, and sometimes African American, they don't have that privilege of wearing a mask and walking in the dark with mask. You know, they will be, you know, perceived different. So there is other stigma there that goes with the mask.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so I live in Indiana, which has a strong streak of libertarianism. So I definitely have heard the argument of, you know, people can't tell me what to do. You know, whether you think it's like, oh, I'm not going to let my mother tell me what to do,
Yeah.
or whether you think, you know, that we're all doing this individually and it doesn't really matter. You know, I don't care about the community. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. That's my right. I mean, there are lots of political arguments. And I remember I did read that article, and that woman too was also calling it radical selfishness. This whole stance of like, it doesn't matter what I do. I don't have any effect on the community around me.
I see.
So, I don't want to say that there's nothing to that, because that was certainly, you know, a compelling argument. And especially when you talk to people and they're telling you their experience, like, of course, we have to take that seriously. So the thing I think is really important to recognize is that even when the pandemic hit, people had all kinds of preconceived ideas about what it meant to cover your face. So in Asia, for example, the interview I did for Vox, this person had spent some time as a journalist in Hong Kong and was describing how people there were so much more willing to just immediately start wearing masks when the pandemic started. And it was, you know, asking basically, why is it that people in Europe and the US didn't react the same way? Well, definitely part of it is that we didn't have the same history. So like Hong Kong had already dealt with SARS. And so, I mean, that definitely prompted a lot of people to get used to the idea of wearing masks. And so SARS never became a big, I mean, there were people in the US who had SARS, but it never really took off as a pandemic here.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't have that same kind of widespread experience. But then also when you think about, you know, what do we think about people who wear masks? I mean, aside from all the issues with like facial recognition software, when you think about the history in this country of people who wear masks, it's like outlaws, gang members, bank robbers, KKK members. I mean, I can come up with like a long history of quote unquote bad guys who wear masks. So if you don't want to be a bad guy, or you don't want to be told what to do, or, you know, Muslim women are the ones who cover their faces, and I'm not Muslim and I'm not a woman and nobody's going to tell me what to do. I mean, those are all like, these are all just, even if people don't consciously recognize it, this rhetoric has been just swirling in the media for the last decade. And so even if you don't consciously come out and say like, I don't want people to think that I'm a Muslim woman, that's still, you know, in the cultural milieu.
Mm-hmm. You rather to die macho or a Muslim than been accused of being a Muslim. That's even worse than dying from the disease. And we look at how a society that visual and clothes is very part of their identity, very part of their life, and how they express themselves.
Yes.
And you know, I'm sure the fashion industry, clothes industry, you know, spend billions of dollars to tell us what to wear and what to swear means, and more clothes, less clothes, and why would people accept that? You know, accept Victoria's Secret? I haven't figured out what the secret was, and people pay thousands of dollars to, instead of adhere the Sharia law, they can adhere to Victoria's Secret or the beauty mystique, or the definition of beauty and fashion and trend coming from the fashion industry.
I think that as consumers, we also tell these businesses what we want to wear. It's not just a one-way street. Like they're just telling, they're not imposing. If nobody bought what they were selling, they quickly got out of business.
Consumer culture oppression coming from a very powerful few individuals that define what beauty is and what should we wear and what trends are. But in something as critical as spreading the disease and I thought that bring the community together, and even if you are not comfortable with wearing a mask, you're doing it for the good for the community.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I do see some of that happening now. I've definitely seen people posting things online like, you know, hey, wearing a mask is not just about me. This is about showing my care and concern for other people, for my community. So I do think some people are getting that. I hope even in a conservative place like where I live now, I do see the tide kind of turning a bit. There are definitely still some people refusing to wear masks, but I think a lot more people are doing it than
Well,
were.
I think that article said, 97%, I think it was the number of people they contact them, they were wearing masks.
Oh, well, my local grocery store is definitely not 97% of people who are wearing
There's
one.
other 3%.
Maybe like 60 to 70% who are wearing a mask at any given
That's
time.
not bad. And I mean, how is it different from the north and the south? In
Mm,
this article was talking about people in the south look at mask differently than people in the north, and being
mm,
hard worker or being pussy. I think that was people, you are a liberal pussy wearing a mask. That kind of
mm.
things that happen in the south. So that the idea of mask is not a macho enough that you like. Trump. He goes to a hospital and not wearing masks.
Right. Well, heaven forbid that he should be perceived as caring for anyone.
Mm.
That's the opposite of his whole image.
Yeah, he's gonna mess
Right.
up his image, public image, that saying that he's human. Uh,
Right.
but it is uh, this pandemic. It's really making people rethinking a lot of things
It
about
really is.
their life and their relationship and what is meaningful, what these priorities is, and those part of the debate. It will take years to really understand the impact this pandemic has on our society and our culture, economy, and the world all in general. And then on the top of that, we have the killing of George Floyd, break out almost intifada or American Spring all over the country. So there's a lot of anxiety out there, and people might say, "Well, what's a mask in the midst of all of this police brutality and economic collapse?" So mask will be the least of my concern.
But it's not, I want to emphasize that it's not just fashion. So I'm writing an article, or well, I've written a conference paper. I'm participating in a conference next month that's being hosted by someone in Russia, interestingly enough. And so the focus of the conference is entirely about the pandemic and how people are responding to it, and all about fashion, right? So, and predictably, there are some that are like, oh, this is such a great opportunity, and how could we brand this? And so of course there's some of that. But so I'm the presentation that I've written for that. I've been doing some research for the last year about working class service industry uniforms. So like nurses and doctors, grocery store workers, delivery drivers, gas station attendants,
A construction worker.
Right. Like anybody who interacts with the public and they
Yeah.
do it while wearing a uniform, right?
Yeah.
That's part of my research. So
Wow.
the history, yeah. Because this really goes right along with the history of ready to wear. So this is a history now that is very rich. It's about 150, 200 years old. Many companies that make uniforms have been in business a long time. Like they're much more stable than your typical fashion company. But the thing is, so this is the focus of this conference paper, is that when the pandemic started, people who were, kind of frontline workers, like grocery store workers and fast food workers, they started asking their employers, like, can I wear a mask to work? And in some cases, their employers said no. And so you might wonder, what's happening there? Why would anyone say no?
Yeah.
And so I'm getting into kind of the symbolism of uniforms, the legal implications of uniforms. So the thing is, like masks, yeah, they're a medical device, but because they're also an item of dress, they can be restricted by company dress codes. If your employer tells you you have to wear a mask or you're not going to be
I
employed
see.
here, they
I
have the
see.
right to do that.
Yeah.
And they also conversely have the right to say, if you wear a mask, you're not going to be employed here.
But how about you can see a lot of trends and fashion even in a device, medical
Right.
device like that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
how that plays out?
Well, it's starting to show up now. So I've started to see my first, corporate uniform branded masks. I saw someone at Kroger wearing a blue Kroger mask with the Kroger logo on it.
Yeah, Nike mask, whatever.
Right, for sure. So I'm sure that we're going to see more of those. Also now, I mean, because it was such a sudden change, a lot of the fashion companies, even the fast fashion companies, didn't immediately have masks that they could sell to people. So the first place that you could buy them was through small, like local connections, or, you know, people selling on like Etsy and eBay. So very small scale.
Or you make them, or whatever.
Yeah. So they're pretty much homemade masks.
Yeah.
Now you're starting to see like Old Navy has masks and Redbubble has masks.
Yeah.
Actually, I just looked on Redbubble yesterday, and they already had more than 24,000 different designs that you could purchase for masks.
They can transform ideas to money. You know, we are you materialize ideas. As a marketing professor myself, one of the biggest challenge a marketer have in a such free market economy is how do you mass market individualism?
Right.
And how do you tell people you are very unique, but there is another 10 million people. So, but I was always joking or entertaining the idea why the West have problem with Islamic attire or Islamic clothes or Islamic, especially women. You know, when you look at the people who are in the Gulf, men almost wear hijab. You know, they cover their head. And so why that's not an issue that these men are oppressed or what? I don't know who's oppressing the men that wear hijab, Saudi Arabia or Dubai, whatever. So that's not. So it is about the woman itself that the West is concerned that she's inherently oppressed. But some people might say Burqa is the biggest, strongest feminist statement can women do. You know, just eliminate the objectation of women and look at the sex object.
Right.
Would you think if Victoria's Secret, like what Nike did, get a hold of Burqa or what they call them, burkini, and put a logo on it, or Victoria's Secret put a logo on a hijab? It has to be in the context of commercial or as a commercial value.
I don't know. I mean, Nike does have a burkini that they sell.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure just slapping a logo on it really does much because, I mean, there definitely are non-Muslims who wear burkinis. Like Ahida Zanetti, who is the one who initially created that design, has given interviews about how she has a lot of customers who are not Muslim. People who want something that's more modest. So other religions where modesty is important, like Mormons, Conservative and Orthodox Jews. I mean, there are other religious groups where people want to dress modestly.
So it's not just because it's gonna make me faster or
I mean, for for Olympic athletes, that can definitely be part of the attractions.
Turn into a fish.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know if you remember those swimsuits the shark skin swimsuits that people won Olympics. Yeah, everyone who set a record with one of those now has a little asterisk next to their name because they realized that those suits actually were giving people an unfair advantage.
At the end, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor Heather Akou. She is assistant professor of fashion history in Indiana University. Thank you so much. I'll load that and I'll let you go.
Okay.
Sounds
good. Yep. Thank you.
Before you call the cops, I just want you to know the first thing that I did when I woke up this morning was yell at my alarm clock. My parents were raised in the South. I have to roll Tide or they'll disown me. They raised me in Las Vegas. That city still has my heart. I hate spiders. I'm a vegetarian. I'm not proud about it. I've done goat yoga. I'm really not proud about that. I can tell you every single word off the NWA Straight Outta Compton album. I can also sing you every single word from Oklahoma. Bananas are disgusting. I am a Christian. I spend almost every Sunday morning teaching kids in Sunday school. I am often asked if I am Muslim. I'm okay with that. I'm pretty much convinced if you met my mother, you'd automatically become a better person. My father is a veteran. He taught me how to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, to everyone that I meet. I don't hate our president. I pray for him. I love basketball and also hockey. This is my brother, James. This is my brother, Mike. This is my brother, John. And this is my brother, Rob. I've never been to jail. I've never owned a gun. I hate that anyone at all might possibly be afraid of me. I'd go around the world and back again if I knew that single act might make your day better. I'm a proud man. I'm a proud black man. Does any of this really matter? No. I just wanted you to get to know me better before you called the cops.